things like P&Ls, profit and loss statements, which aren't typical coursework in J-School, and also cross-disciplinary work. That's when I started working with my first engineers and designers and had a lot of fun doing that. Then as an innovation product manager, before joining the Institute, I was at the Guardian Mobile Innovation Lab. Got a sense of what it was like to put a team budget together, do event planning, kind of evangelize for innovation, and that has kind of added to my skill set as well. And then as an innovation team manager now at the Institute, learning a little bit about management, so we're all works in progress, but this is kind of the roles I've had and how they relate to the skills that I've developed over time. So I'll hand off to Danny.
Hey everybody, so I'm Danny Sanchez, a senior product manager on Gannett's consumer experience team. And so up here we have a very quick little, mini LinkedIn version, right? Essentially, I started as an intern newspaper reporter, and I am very deliberate about the term newspaper reporter because I was pretty ignorant to the way of the internet. I was out there covering city commission meetings, really just nose down and that sort of work. And essentially, I did an internship that opened my eyes to digital as an online producer. So if you'll notice, the career track there just gets progressively nerdier as time goes by. The real inflection point for me was when they appended that term webmaster to my title. And I felt super legit. This was in the mid-2000s, so about a decade behind on that. But really, in each role that I held, I was fairly ignorant to the vocabulary, the terminology, even just the ways of that next step. And I find that that's very true in the news industry. You're often doing a job that is actually another job, but you have a title like audience editor or managing editor, planning editor, whatever, online producer. So really it was later on when I moved to that Newsroom product engineer role where I started building Python apps and deploying web apps and really working much more firmly in the tech space out to now working in product that really ties everything together. So I think part of this progression for me was just learning about that next step, kind of often maybe after it happened or as it happened, and also just doing learning on the side that really fell outside of my traditional education. Often I took classes as a non-degree seeking student at community colleges just to learn C++ and programming or database design and object-oriented software design. Some of it is open online classes. Really just a lot of learning that happened outside the framework of my work. So really that accelerated my progression to more nerdiness, which I'm thoroughly enjoying. So I guess I'll kick it back to Kim for team structures.
Okay, so the Philadelphia Innovation Team. At the end of the day, we are guided by a North Star across the organization, which is this idea of being indispensable. That means being ambitious, that means being useful, and being engaging. And I'm not going to read all the words underneath, you guys kind of get it, but when we're looking at projects to focus on, this is the filter by which we choose. Our team structure is simple and complex at the same time. You can see here that I have an innovation team editor. She's in the room. Megan, put up your hand. Megan's got a background that's strong in editorial investigation. And this was an interesting choice to lead the team because, traditionally you see a lot of tech people that come in the lead, but we've made a decision that historically, when we worked on interactives, we worked on sort of experiments, they were super cool. We did all sorts of data stuff, but often the story was lacking, that there was no there. There was a lot of playing with technology, and we wanted to make sure that as a team integrated into the newsroom, we really had that editorial heft. We have a full stack newsroom developer, which was very exciting for us. Chris Williams joined us, and he really gives us an opportunity to move ahead. We do have a product and IT team, but as you guys know probably, often they're so focused on enterprise projects in the long term that you can never get the shorter stuff day to day, so we really wanted to make sure he was in there. And then we have 2 interactive developers who are focused on front-end usability, design, building things out. I was really cognizant of making sure that we were very client-focused. What that doesn't mean is people don't come to us at the last minute and throw a bunch of things on our plate and say, make it look pretty. Historically, that happened. But at the same time, we are partnering and plugging in and making sure that we are serving the story and serving the project. We're involved from day one, and as you can see here, a typical project team involves us with editors, reporters, data reporters, designers, engagement editors, a whole mix of people. We practice design thinking to lead a lot of what we do, so we make sure that there's a lot of great brainstorming that happens, and we'll bring people in from right across the organization. Sales, marketing, folks are always really super excited to be part of it. And then we work with various clients and partners throughout the organization. We work really hard. Our whole newsroom now, we don't use the language business and newsroom anymore, which I'm sure many of you have sort of moved past that as well. But we have a real opportunity to bring these folks in and inform our projects, and we do so. We lead by example. When we got together, I inherited, the background is we had tried this a little bit. We had called it an experiments team. It didn't quite work. It didn't have developers. We had been an interactives team, and sort of that didn't, there was no project process, so they weren't always set up to put together their best work. So when we kicked it off, I got 30 people from across the organization and offsite, including the Lenfest Institute, and we brainstormed around what this should be. This was not my idea. I was here to facilitate the process, and I brought in the best thinkers. After that, I set out the team to challenge, and I said, we need to have structure. You need to make a structure to break a structure. I'm not going to hold you to it, but we need some sanity here so that we can do quality work. And they went away over the course of a few weeks. NPR's process, they researched a whole bunch of processes, both news and non-newsroom, and they came up with this, which has been really super helpful to us because it's visual, so everybody can start to understand what we're trying to do here, and we can make conscious decisions when we want to skip pieces. So far it's been fairly good that way. And I like to say, and some of you will probably giggle, there's often a lack of planning in newsrooms and project management, but 80% of news can be planned. It just isn't. Best advice I ever got from a mentor. Some of our project examples over the course of the last few months have been, we took a voter's guide to start with, just a little baby project. Everybody does voter's guides, no big deal. We reinvented it. We really spent time back to the design thinking and holding workshops and talking to end users, and we really broke that out, and it was quite successful. Some of the measurements we saw were engagement time, signups, and all that good stuff. We worked with the Lenfest Institute on an SMS project during municipal election, which was really great. We worked on a map for the shore. If any of you have been to Philadelphia, people are obsessed with the shore. So what we did is we created the service that gave all conditions of all shore locations in New Jersey and Delaware. And that information existed on state sites, but it was a mess. It was really difficult to find. And we did everything from helping find directions to all sorts of good stuff, and that was quite popular as well. And then here you see the morning newscast, which for me, we did a smart speaker morning newscast, and it's on Google and Alexa and all that great stuff. And that was kind of the flashpoint to get this lab going. The team itself didn't work on the actual broadcast, although now they do, but it helped me build the case that we needed this function. Here you can see more examples. Here's an example of folks texting back and forth to our audience. And I have to once again thank the Lenfest Institute for being part of that. Now, when it comes to measurement is, complex, but I think it's really important, and I'm passionate, and we'll continue to talk about that I think we have to be responsible, we have to be working on the right stuff, it has to be aligned, because at the end of the day, our industry is challenged, and if we don't work on things that align with the strategy and the business, none of us are going to have jobs to innovate in. So we take a look at technical KPIs. This is an example from a project. We break it down. Some of these are learning goals, stretch goals, all that good stuff. We also look at editorial KPIs and audience KPIs. So once again, a breakdown of some of our examples, and we do a post-mortem to check in with ourselves. And then finally, we are moving to a place where we are thinking about subscriptions and registration, although more registration, and by registration I mean newsletter sign up, to get into the funnel, the front funnel, and how it fits the business, but we're working on that. Danny?
So the team that I work on at Gannett is the consumer experience team, which I actually joined earlier this February. And it's essentially comprised of developers, UX designers, product managers, project managers. It's a fairly large group. The idea behind sort of telling you about this today is to have an example of a group that really works with a really broad geographic base with lots of small publications and large as well. So that sort of poses some different challenges with how we grab ideas, how we scale out ideas, how we scale out experiments and communicate them. So the way that we approach our philosophy of building things is we really try to understand the domain and understand the problem before we tackle it. And that's not to say that we suffer from analysis paralysis or anything like that, but we really just try to have a sense of what is our end goal, what are the problems that we are trying to solve. We also support risk-taking as well, and that means essentially doing experiments where we really don't know the outcomes. Right? There's a certain degree of uncertainty. Many news organizations have been conservative in the past, sort of working in the space they're really familiar with. So we really try to encourage our teams to make some bold experiments, make some bold bets, but always with material measurable value. So we try not to experiment, let's say, for experimentation's sake or strictly for learning. Like any good experiment, you need a hypothesis, and we try to define that really well at the onset so that we know, was that experiment a success? Those learnings that we get out of it, those may be the goal, but we're always looking at that outcome at the end of it. And then lastly, we've done a lot of work over actually the last few years to ensure we have really good pipelines for user feedback. We've instituted a lot of different technology to make sure that we're calling out to users. What did you think of this experience? What did you think of what you saw? Having a direct line to certain editors and getting that feedback to the right people throughout the organization. Sometimes that's our consumer experience team only. Other times it's editors, reporters in the newsrooms. It can be a big challenge in a large organization to get that feedback to the right people. And so that's a really key goal for our team. Now, some of the high-level themes of the consumer experience team are up here: newsroom enablement, attract new audiences, et cetera. The reason that I'm sharing this here is because that your group is about. What are the things that you're focused on? And so there's a lot of talk in product about OKRs and KPIs and SMART goals and all these things that kind of become these massive documents and spreadsheets and things. But at the end of the day, when you go and you talk to the newsroom about your team, you should be able to sum that up in 2 or 3 words, whatever those top line goals are. And so this really helps us focus, understand our identity, and understand our priorities. And there are KPIs and OKRs that back into all of these themes. That's definitely not left out. But we really want to have a concise way of talking about it. And so there's some other themes here that might apply differently to different organizations or yours. So I would just encourage you to give that some thought, like what are the 2 and 3 words that describe your goals. So these are some of our values. Lots there. I'm not going to chew into all of that. But what's interesting about setting a core set of values for your innovation team, and yours will be different, right, from this, is that it gives everybody a reference point for making, decisions out of debates and really driving conversation. So I've heard engineers in our organization frequently refer to do fewer things better. That's a really good North Star when we're trying to do too many things, perhaps, or really just focus on the things that we should be doing. Seeing the whole picture, owning your commitments. All of these I've seen us refer to when we're debating a course of action. It's a really useful set of North Stars for us. And then lastly, I wanted to share our idea intake process, and I know this is like a very imposing spreadsheet, right, or diagram. This is really as part of our onboarding process for people on our team to understand what's the flow of ideas and pitches that come in. So essentially, when we get a new request in, and remember, we're dealing with 110 publications, USA Today as well, there are a lot of people pitching things. So we want to make sure that when those ideas come in, we're tracking them, we're assessing them really well, and giving clarity to people about their ideas and what the status of them are. So essentially, they come in, we refine them. The champion of that idea will conduct research, essentially create a project pitch. Sometimes that goes in OQ where edits are requested, so there's a little bit of a circle there where we might come back and add more analysis or some more research. And then from there, if it's not approved, but we're like, hey, this is kind of a good idea, let's hold on to it, we'll put it in a holding tank, right, where we can refer to the next time we're doing our prioritization exercises. We can look into that list and say, hey, there were some good ideas here we really couldn't get to in that quarter, or maybe it wasn't the right time. In other cases, it might be approved, and then it becomes a question of capacity. And this is really important for your innovation teams because some of us move so rapidly, they're kind of skunk worksy and all that. You want to have a good understanding of what you can handle in a given sprint or quarter, right? So knowing what your capacity is really helps you triage these ideas. So from there, it might go into a holding queue, right? And that's the first place we check back when we're doing prioritization again. We say, what were the really good ideas we just didn't have resource but we really wanted to do? Or you go ahead and that's when the magic happens. It's approved, right? So I know this is fairly complex, but I would encourage you, even in teams as small as 4 and 5, to really have a thought-through process of how you are managing those ideas, right? And communicating that out to the people who pitch them and the stakeholders who are involved in them. Just one other quick thing I mentioned. So we actually have another innovation team at Gannett, the storytelling studio, that is very focused on the newsrooms and telling individual stories and building some newsroom tools. So they're doing a show and tell Friday at noon in Suite 4802 if you want to learn about their kind of intake process and their pitching and how they prioritize things. So I think that's it for me. So.
Excellent. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit for a few minutes about the LenFest Local Lab. Just a quick sense of the nitty-gritty. So our staffing, we are a cross-functional UX product and discovery team of about 6 people. I'm the product manager and lead. We also have an editorial director, Andre Nada. He is in charge of kind of getting our insights out, right? So it's one thing to kind of do the work to run an experiment, but since we are part of a nonprofit and trying to kind of share what we learn, he's in charge of making sure that we kind of have our own editorial, right? So kind of write about our work and tell our story. We also have 2 engineers who work remotely in New York. And we have a kind of a full stack. She's amazing, Faye. She does all of our research and design, so everything from putting together a survey, deploying it, doing in-person interviews, creating wireframes, moving into the mood board phases, and then kind of getting us to final visual design. So that's a role that she plays. And then we also have a full-time analyst, so somebody who talks to us in advance is kind of like a kind of our product therapist. We talk to her about, what is the ideal experience that somebody can have with this experiment? And we talked to her for a long time about that, and she comes back with a success framework document for us, right? And says, here's what you've said is the experience you want people to have with this new product, and here's how you can measure it both quantitatively and qualitatively. So that becomes kind of our Bible from there on out. So that's kind of the roles that we have on our team and the folks that we think are necessary to do kind of full product development and experimentation. Our funding, we mentioned that, where does innovation come from? Luckily, we are funded by the LenFest Institute for Journalism based in Philadelphia. And it's a nonprofit whose mission is to support sustainable local journalism. So the Institute, if you're not familiar with them, does various programming around high-impact journalism, diversity and inclusion, and also innovation. So we kind of fall under that innovation bucket. Our setup, just kind of a quick note so it makes a little bit more sense. The Institute, we are part of their innovation programming. They also own the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is why we kind of tend to work with Kim and her team and the entire newsroom a lot on our experiments. And also the icon at the bottom, so we share our insights on Medium. So if you look up LenFest Local Lab on Medium, we write about our research process, we write about the statistics when they come back, and also a little bit about the process of collaboration. So we'll kind of give an inside look into what it's like, when do we hit roadblocks, and how do we get around them. Our goal is quite simple, actually. It's just to test things, to ship things, to try things, right? I think we can all get in our own heads. Sometimes maybe there can be too many Post-it notes in a room, and we're not kind of getting things out into the world and finding out how real customers are reacting to things. So our mandate was simple. It was just to actually ship about 6 to 8 new products in the course of a year. And then also, of course, share the insights and the code. We have a public GitHub, if you'd like to check that out. And have some of our products take root in actual newsrooms. When we started, we weren't quite sure if we were going to be doing kind of proofs of concept and just kind of scraping content and putting things out there. But we've developed a really great partnership with Kim and her team and with the Inquirer. Luckily, I worked there 10 years ago, so I had been there 10 years prior, and when I walked back into the newsroom, there was some familiarity there. So it's been a really, really great partnership, because what I always like to say is content is the product, right? So without that kind of deep understanding of each other's goals, we wouldn't be able to get these things off the ground. So that is our goal in the lab. In terms of our process, there's structure, it's just a little bit lighter, and it varies, right? So Kim mentioned something really interesting about how, their process is visual, which usually scares me because then everybody wants you to do every part of the process, but also once you articulate what your steps are, you can articulate why you've skipped something, which I think is really powerful. So it was good to hear that. But so we have a pretty informal intake. Typically ideas come from our team. We have this theme of location, right? So when I came back into the local space, I did interviews with about 40 people at the Inquirer, at the Lenfest Institute, and then also just folks in the industry, and said, what kind of innovation does local need? Because I had been working at kind of a national and international publications for quite some time and was coming back into local. And I heard a lot about how we have the content to innovate, just not the time or the resources, right? Which presumably resonates with folks. And I thought, I've been thinking a lot about location and kind of lat long and how we think about the relationship between where a story occurs and where somebody is. And you can make some really powerful combinations on a local level that you can't always at kind of national and international publications. So our intake is quite informal. It tends to kind of come organically from our team, or if there are ideas bubbling up in the newsroom, sometimes Kim will send me a note and there's some really thoughtful ideas coming from the newsroom, and there might be 10 or so, and we'll kind of pick something out and say, hey, we feel really energized by this idea, let's work on it together. And then we do a little bit of light research, right? So typically we won't talk to more than maybe 30 people in person before we run an experiment, just to kind of balance the amount of time we spend on research with the kind of amount of risk we're taking with launching the product. And then we just do iterative dev and design. So we have a Slack channel, we share wireframes, we start developing things, we have beta versions of the app and just kind of take our time. And then we do soft launches, so we don't do kind of big press releases or shouting from the heavens, because these products are experiments, right? And don't necessarily warrant kind of all of that work. The idea is to get a couple of hundred people into an experiment to give it a try. A statistically significant sample, which typically is about 400 people given our audience size in Philly. And then we just see what happens. And we measure, we use that kind of success framework that I mentioned earlier, and quantitatively and qualitatively measure our experiments, and then we report back. So all of our insights are out there on Medium. As I mentioned, again, our process is light because our risk is low. We're working quickly, and we have kind of a bias towards quick insights, so kind of a pass-fail type process. A quick example, these are my favorite types of slides. So this is an app that we put into the App Store. It's called Here for Local Journalism. Forgive the name. We were early on in our development, but so what we did was we took a bunch of, there's a Pulitzer Prize winning history of buildings and the role they play in our communities and society for the past few decades. So we thought, if we want to play around with this notion of location, let's kind of geotag her stories, and if somebody installs the app and is near a place that she's written about, that story will come to them, right? So we're trying to make the discovery process easier. And that is kind of what we did. So you can see kind of the launch screen, and then the second screen is an example of a notification that you would get if you walked by Love Park. And if you clicked on the notification, it would click through to the article on the Inquirer. So our process for that was pretty light. The intake was that we wanted to explore location. We went out and got feedback from about 30 people on the idea. And then I kind of mentioned this process, but we created wireframes, mood boards, coded a few things. In terms of our launch plan, it was a couple of tweets and 2 articles, one on Medium and one on Inquirer.com. And in terms of measurement, like the highlight there is that location-aware alerts. So if somebody has kind of opted in, they've installed an app that is going to send you push notifications for architecture stories, and they're going to come when you're near a place that's been written about. We saw click-through rates of about 5 times higher than you get for a regular push notification, which makes sense, right? You're kind of, obviously someone has opted in and it's more relevant, but we had a really small sample size. And our business rules were such that you had to come within 100 meters of this location to get the notification, which means that only a third of people who installed the app ever got a notification, right? So immediately you're learning about kind of the limitations of this. And you think about how you might apply kind of geotagging or location-aware alerts to maybe the broader local news agenda, but for me and for our team, it's easier to start here, right, and learn these things as you go. And the big insights, too, are just that location does matter, right? So I think we got kind of an early indication of that. We also learned that the tech works, right? So there was no guarantee that these notifications were actually going to start triggering when people got near these locations. And then from an editorial perspective, we realized that writing for a place, like writing a story to be written in the place that it's written about, is kind of different. And if you want to talk about that, happy to chat with folks after. Our prioritization. I love this picture because it's like, wouldn't that be nice if you didn't have to prioritize anything? But we just kind of focus on speed, common sense, and using what you already have. So I think I mentioned earlier that a lot of the feedback I got was that we have the content to innovate, but we don't have the time or the resources. So I really wanted to focus on not having our type of innovation, burden the newsroom in any way, but just to work with all of the amazing content that already exists and how do we deliver it better and create better experiences for it. So kind of rule number one is that it has to be customer facing. You can really get dragged into other cool and interesting projects that are kind of research-based or internal tools, but our mandate is to make sure that we get feedback from actual customers. Also, we try to make sure that it's kind of local specific, right? So is it something that's really going to be a new product idea or a new approach to local news as opposed to other types of stories? Do we have the content? Do we all see the value? So from kind of a management perspective, like a majority of folks on the team, it's better if they're kind of bought into this idea and really, really passionate about it. There might be one or two outliers, but it's important to me that we all kind of feel bought in, especially when you have those days where, the wireframes aren't working or the testing results come back and you're feeling really down about it. But we all kind of are invested in that eventual insight that we're going to get from launching the product. So that's important to us. And can we launch quickly? So if it's something that's going to take, 6, 12 months, there's not kind of a back-end system to support it, then we tend to push it to the side, since that doesn't really work with our process. In terms of measurement, again, that's kind of simple but complex, to borrow from Kim. We measure ourselves just by launching new products and also sharing the insights in the code online. But then we measure the experiments with just kind of these basic things. Are they useful? What did we learn, right? I will give you an example of this. So this is an app that came up in an earlier session. It's called Philly Eats, if you want to install it, just to kind of poke around. And what we did was we took a couple hundred restaurant reviews that are written by Craig Laban, the critic at the Philadelphia Inquirer. And we just wanted to make them easier to find, search, save, that type of thing. So people often call it kind of like Yelp for local news, but we really think that if folks are not interested in kind of UGC or like user-generated reviews, and they actually want kind of less instead of more, that this would be kind of the perfect place for folks to come in and try that out. So when you install the app, you kind of see the cards with all of the restaurant reviews at the bottom. You can see the map, so you can see where you are. It actually defaults to showing you at the center and then the 5 closest restaurants. And then you can do a bunch of cool things. So search for a restaurant review, filter by various criteria in the middle, look by cuisine. And then when you click through and you're interested in a restaurant, you don't have to read the full review. We've just kind of pulled out what to eat and what to drink, which can be really handy if you're actually already at the restaurant as well. But if you want to make a reservation, call, or read the full review, that's all right there for you as well. So how did we think about measuring this type of app? Oh, we also send notifications. So when there's a restaurant opening, you'll get notified. And then if you favorite a restaurant, we'll ping you when you're nearby. So we kind of kept that location theme going. We have a really robust dashboard for this app. But one of the things that's really, really interesting that we realized that we could start tracking is kind of a correlation between reading a restaurant review and actually visiting the restaurant. So one of the permissions that people have to give is for us to know your location while you're using this app. Actually, all the time, not just when you're using the app. So we'd be able to see if somebody read the review about Oyster House on Tuesday, and then they actually kind of show up in that restaurant. And if you spend more than 15 minutes in the location, we can kind of get a sense that you're there. And it really starts to kind of help us understand the relationship between this type of content and then what people are actually doing in real life. We also measure just kind of how all of the functionality is used or not. So this is kind of our behavioral pattern analysis dashboard, which you don't have to read all of that, but it'll tell us on the right-hand side, are people searching more or are they filtering more? And then that'll give us a sense of how people like to navigate this content. And the last one, what type of filtering is most useful? So something that was interesting in our research is that people said that price was really, really important when they were deciding where to eat. But when you actually look at how they're using the app, the neighborhood that the restaurant is in tends to be what people are focusing on a lot more. So those are just kind of a few things that we learn when we kind of really dig in and analyze. So unless we have anything else, we're going to get to our kind of group discussion. Great, and then we'll do this for about